Đấy là có đi gấp. Vâng.
The morning air was heavy with mist as the old couple, Mr. Dew and his wife, moved through the dense forest, gathering bundles of firewood like they did every week. Their steps were slow but steady, backs bent with age but spirits resilient. "Have you seen this much firewood before?" she asked, brushing her hands together to shake off the splinters. "We won't need more for a couple of days. Don't worry if it rains." "I've seen more," he replied with a slight grin. "But yes, this should last." Just as he bent to pick up another branch, she froze. Her eyes narrowed toward the ravine below. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Someone's calling for help." "What voice?" Mr. Dew straightened, squinting. "There. I'm telling you, it's a human voice." He strained his ears and this time he heard it, faint but real. A cry. A scream. "Let's go down. Someone's in trouble." They climbed cautiously down the slope, gripping onto branches for balance. A soft whimper rose from somewhere beneath a tangle of wild grass and ferns. There she is," Mrs. Dew gasped, pointing. A girl lay half covered by foliage, her body twisted painfully, legs scratched, arms limp. Her clothes were torn, muddy, her face pale and slick with sweat. "She's alive," Mr. Dew exclaimed, kneeling beside her. "Her pulse is faint, but she's breathing." "How did she fall here?" "Oh, dear child. Where did you come from?" "We need help," Mrs. Dew said. "We can't carry her ourselves." "I'll go call Ton." Mr. Dew stood abruptly. "He'll help us get her down." The girl stirred, groaning weakly. Her lips parted, cracked and dry. "Water," she murmured. Mrs. Dew quickly poured water into a bamboo cup, gently lifting the girl's head. "Here, drink this. It's okay now. We're here." Minutes passed. Then footsteps crunched behind them. Ton, a local villager, appeared breathless and concerned. "Someone's injured?" he asked. "Yes, a young girl, bad fall." "Help me carry her down," Mr. Dew ordered. Together, the three of them formed a makeshift stretcher with jackets and branches, lifting her gently, careful not to worsen her condition. As they walked back down the mountain path, the girl drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering incoherent words. She clutched at something around her neck. A string with a small, strange charm. "Do you recognize her?" Mrs. Dew asked Ton. "No. Never seen her before." He shook his head. "She's not from around here." "She must have wandered into the woods alone," Mr. Dew muttered. "Or maybe she ran away from something." Back at the cottage, the room was small but warm. A thin blanket was spread over her frail body. Mrs. Dew dabbed the girl's forehead with a wet cloth, concern creasing her brow. "She's burning up," she whispered. "Let me check her leg," Ton said. He gently examined the limb, wincing. "Not broken, just sprained. We need to bandage it fast." "I'll get the herbs," Mrs. Dew said, moving swiftly. They worked as a team, cleaning wounds, applying ointment, wrapping bandages with practiced hands. "She's lucky you hurt her," Ton said quietly. "No one should be left like that. Alone, scared, bleeding," Mr. Dew murmured. After a while the girl stirred again. Her voice was hoarse but clearer. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Mrs. Dew reassured her. "You fell down the mountain. We found you." The girl's eyes widened in confusion, then slowly filled with tears. "I don't remember." Later that night, the fire crackled in the hearth. Outside the wind howled. Inside the cottage felt like a sanctuary. "Where do you think she came from?" Mrs. Dew asked. Mr. Dew shook his head. "She doesn't have anything with her. No ID. No phone. Just that necklace." They stared at the strange charm. "Maybe she's running from something," Mrs. Dew whispered. "Or someone," Ton added. "She doesn't look like someone who got lost picking berries." "No," Mr. Dew agreed. "She looks like she's been through hell." Meanwhile the girl dreams. In her fevered sleep the girl, whose name no one knew yet, twisted and trembled. In her mind shadows loomed. A scream. A dark figure chasing through the woods. Her feet slipping. The sudden weightlessness. Then pain. She whispered a name one none of them caught. At dawn. Mrs. Dew brought a cup of warm rice porridge to the girl's bedside. Try to eat a little, she said softly. The girl stared at her hands, bruised, scratched, trembling. I don't know who I am, she whispered. Mr. Dew sat by her side. It's okay. You don't need to remember right now. Just rest. We'll help you, Mrs. Dew added. You're not alone. She nodded, lips quivering. For the first time since they found her, the girl smiled faintly. The sun peeked through the shutters. In the small wooden house, the scent of boiling herbs filled the air. The girl lay still under a blanket, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her bruises had started to fade, but her eyes remained closed. Mrs. Dew sat by her side, carefully wiping sweat from her brow. Mr. Dew sipped tea in silence. She still doesn't remember anything? He asked. Mrs. Dew shook her head. She barely opens her eyes. I think the fever's clouding her memory. Just then, a soft groan escaped the girl's lips. Her eyes fluttered open. Water, she croaked. Mrs. Dew rushed to her with a cup. You're awake. Drink slowly, dear. The girl drank, her hand trembling. She looked around the room, her gaze unfocused, as if seeing the world for the first time. Where am I? You're safe now, Mr. Dew said gently. We found you in the forest. You were unconscious. She blinked. I don't remember who I am. Later that morning, Ton returned with a small satchel. Anything she had on her? He asked. Mr. Dew handed him a thin piece of cord with a charm. Just this necklace. And the clothes she wore, nothing else. Ton examined the charm. It looked handmade. A faded letter carved into it. No name tag. No phone. Nothing. We have to report this, Mrs. Dew said. She might have family looking for her. I'll speak to the village chief, Ton offered. See if anyone filed a missing person. They nodded. The girl remained silent, as if the weight of being nameless had crushed her voice. As the days passed, she healed slowly. Mrs. Dew changed her bandages with gentle hands. Mr. Dew told her stories to make her laugh. But the girl, though grateful, remained distant. One night, she stared at her reflection in a small mirror Mrs. Dew had placed near her bed. Do you remember anything? Mrs. Dew asked. She shook her head. Only flashes. Running. Falling. A man's voice. Screaming. Nightmares. I don't know if they're dreams or memories. Mrs. Dew sat beside her. You'll remember. In time. What if I'm someone bad? Her voice cracked. You have kind eyes, Mrs. Dew whispered. You couldn't be bad. One afternoon, a man named Qua visited the house. He was a traveling herbalist and had heard about the girl through village talk. I heard there's a girl found injured in the woods, he said, eyes scanning her face. She doesn't remember who she is, Mr. Dew replied cautiously. Qua stepped forward. You look familiar. The girl tensed. Do I know you? He frowned. I think I met you months ago. In Da Nang. You were with another woman. Maybe your sister. Her heartbeat quickened. Da Nang. Yes. You were smiling then. I can't remember. I want to remember so badly. Qua sighed. Sometimes the mind protects us by forgetting. But the heart remembers. Before he left, he handed Mrs. Dew a small pouch. For her sleep, lotus root and mugwort. It may calm her dreams. The next morning she helped Mrs. Dew boil porridge. You should rest, Mrs. Dew insisted. I want to help. It makes me feel real. She limped slightly but moved with grace. Mr. Dew watched her, heart softened. We should call you something, he said. We can't keep saying girl forever. The girl hesitated. Can I choose? Of course. She paused. Then softly said, Lean. Call me Lean. Lean, Mrs. Dew repeated with a smile. A beautiful name. Like the lotus flower. Lean smiled. For the first time it reached her eyes. Days passed peacefully, until the sky darkened. A storm brewed. Thunder rumbled across the hills. Lean sat near the window, her face pale. Her breathing quickened. What's wrong, dear? Mrs. Dew asked. I feel like something bad is coming. This storm. It feels familiar. That night, as the rain poured and lightning flashed, Lean had a vision. She was running barefoot through the forest. A man shouted behind her. Her foot slipped. The edge of the cliff crumbled. Then darkness. She awoke screaming. Mr. Du rushed in. "You're safe, Lean." "It was a dream." "No. It was real. That's how I fell." With her memory fragment returning, Lean examined the charm again. "The letter A. Maybe it's a name," she said. "Or someone important to me." Ton returned that day with news. Still no report of a missing girl. "It's like you don't exist," Lean whispered. "But I do." That evening, while cleaning the necklace, a small slip of paper fell from inside the charm's casing. It was barely legible, water-damaged, but one word remained. "Oma. Oma." Mrs. Du repeated. "Could that be your real name?" "I don't know," she said. "But it feels warm." The next day, a man arrived at the village outskirts. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark clothing. He showed a photo of a girl, bruised, scared, asking villagers if they'd seen her. "Who is he?" Ton asked a nearby farmer. "No idea. But he doesn't seem friendly." News reached Mr. Du. "They're looking for her." "What if he's the reason she ran?" Mrs. Du asked. Lean overheard. Her body tensed. "Please don't let him take me." "You're safe here," Mr. Du said firmly. "No one will touch you unless you say yes." That night, Lean stood under the moonlight. Her hair swayed in the breeze. She looked at the hills, the stars, the silence. "I'm not ready to know the truth," she said. "But I'm ready to become someone new." Mrs. Du hugged her. "Then be whoever you want to be. Oma. Lean. You're home here." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know what I did before. But I want to do good now." Morning broke with light rain. Birds chirped. A new day. Lean helped with breakfast. She laughed for the first time. Mr. Du called her our daughter. Ton brought seeds for a garden they'd plant together. The man who searched never returned. Lean began writing in a journal. Her first entry. "They found me in the forest, but I found myself here." The morning was quiet, but Lean's heart wasn't. Ever since she found the word Alma in the necklace, she had been plagued by unease. She still didn't know if it was her real name or someone else's, but it tugged at her like a whisper in the wind. Mr. Du noticed her restlessness. "Still thinking about the charm?" Lean nodded, stirring the porridge in silence. "I believe when something is meant to be remembered, it finds its way back." She smiled weakly. "But what if remembering brings back pain?" He placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "Then you'll be strong enough to face it." Later that day, a letter arrived at the village gate, delivered by a traveling merchant. It bore no return address. Inside was a single sentence written in delicate ink. "Tell Alma she is not safe." The note sent a chill through Mr. Du's spine. He shared it with Mrs. Du and Ton in hushed voices. "We need to be careful," Mr. Du whispered. "Whoever is looking for her knows more than we do. We can't keep her hidden forever," Ton added. "What if they come here?" "They already did," Mrs. Du said, her eyes narrowing. "And they'll come again." They chose not to tell Lean just yet. She had started smiling again, and they didn't want to rip that away. But Lean sensed something was wrong. That night, as the wind swept through the bamboo forest, she had another vision. A man in a black coat reaching for her, his hand bloody, his voice calling her by a name she didn't recognize. Amara. She woke in a cold sweat. In the kitchen, she whispered to herself, "Who am I really?" The next morning, a stranger arrived at the house. He was tall, clean-cut, and wore a pressed shirt that looked oddly formal for the countryside. He introduced himself as Dr. Min, a physician researching trauma and memory recovery. "I heard from a nearby village there's a girl who lost her memory," he said, voice calm and collected. Mr. Du exchanged glances with Ton. "She's not ready to meet strangers." "I don't want to pressure anyone," Min replied. "But I believe I can help." When Lean met him, something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, familiarity, perhaps even fear. "You look familiar," she whispered. Min tilted his head. "Do I? Maybe we've met before." She nodded slowly. "Did you ever live in Da Nang?" "For a time," he said. "But I travel often." Faces blur together. "Your voice," she added. "It's like a dream I've had." Min smiled gently. "Memories work in strange ways. I'd like to help you unlock them." Over the next few days, Min stayed in the village. He began conducting talk sessions with Lean, Nothing forceful, just gentle questions. What's the first thing you remember after waking up here? He asked her one afternoon. I saw a beam of light through the window, she said. And a woman smiling. Do you remember anything from before the forest? She closed her eyes. Running. Pain. Water. A scream. Do you remember a man? I think yes. But I don't know if he was helping me or hurting me. Min took notes, always calm, always patient. But one evening, Mrs. Du saw him slip into the woods alone and speak on a phone, something none of them had seen him carry. Suspicion grew. That night, Tan quietly followed Min into the trees. He heard fragments of a conversation. She's here. Doesn't remember a thing. No, not yet. But it's her. I'm sure of it. Tan returned, his face pale. He's not who he says he is. The next morning, Mr. Du confronted Min. You said you were here to help. But you lied. Min didn't flinch. I never lied. I said I wanted to help, and I do. But she's not just a girl who lost her memory. She's part of something much bigger. Lin, who had overheard everything, stepped forward. What do you mean? Min turned to her, his voice gentle now. Your real name is Amara. You were part of a private psychological research project in the city. You fled when the experiment became dangerous. I don't understand. You were a subject, not a patient. They wanted to study trauma, induce it, then reverse it. But something went wrong. You escaped. Lin staggered back. No. That can't be true. You're not safe, Amara. Others are still looking for you. Dangerous people. If I found you, they will too. Mr. Du stepped between them. She is not going anywhere. Min raised his hands. I don't want to take her. I just want to prepare her. Because they will come. And next time it might not be me knocking at your door. Lin sat alone under the stars that night. Everything Min said echoed in her mind. Was she really part of some twisted research project? Was that why she couldn't remember anything? Mrs. Du sat beside her, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. It doesn't matter who you were, she said. Only who you are now. Lin looked at her, eyes brimming. But what if they come for me? Then we protect you. Like family. The next day Lin made a choice. She would stay. She would learn how to fight, how to heal, how to live, not as a victim but as someone reborn. She asked Tan to teach her how to plant vegetables, how to build a fence. She learned to grind herbs with Mrs. Du, learned to fish with Mr. Du. But she also prepared for the worst. Min left the village quietly a few days later, leaving behind a single page of his notes, details about the organization looking for her, names she didn't recognize, and a single phrase at the bottom. You were never broken. They just feared your strength. As the weeks passed, Lin grew stronger. She laughed louder. Her limp faded. The scar on her cheek softened. But she never forgot. She kept Min's note tucked beneath her pillow. One night, she stood on the hill above the village, looking out into the trees. And for the first time, she whispered to the wind. My name is Lin. I was Amara. And I survived. She found herself drawn more and more to the quiet moments. In the early morning when the fog curled low along the rice fields, Lin would sit by the water's edge and listen to the world breathe. The whispers of frogs, the distant crow of a rooster, the rhythmic creak of a bamboo wind chime. It was all foreign once, but now it calmed her. One day, while walking back from the stream, she noticed an old notebook hidden behind the wooden panels in her room. It must have been forgotten there for years. The first few pages were blank, stained by time. But in the middle, she discovered a pressed flower and a name written in neat cursive. Alma N. She froze. The curve of the letters, the way they looped down into the stem was familiar. Her hand trembled as she traced the letters. Was this really hers? Did this notebook belong to her? She brought it to Mr. Du, who examined it quietly. Maybe this was a gift. Maybe it's a sign, he said. I don't know if I want to remember anymore, she said. But this place. It makes me want to become someone better. You already are, he replied. You're someone we'd fight to keep. The next week, Lin began teaching the village children how to draw. She wasn't sure where the skill came from. Only that her hands moved naturally, guiding the pencil with ease. The children loved her. They called her Teacher Lin. And their laughter filled the empty spaces in her heart. One afternoon, while showing them how to sketch a bird in flight, she felt a sharp flash of memory. Paper burning, someone shouting her name, her own hands covered in ink and blood. She gasped and dropped the pencil. "Are you okay, Miss Lean?" one of the children asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes. Just got dizzy." But that night she couldn't sleep. The memory returned, clearer this time. A man in a lab coat. Her hands tied. Her voice screaming. The charm ripped from her neck and shoved into a glass vial. She sat up, heart racing. She had to tell someone. At sunrise she told Mrs. Dew everything. "I think I wasn't just running from danger. I was a prisoner." Mrs. Dew listened without interruption. Then she said, "You're free now. Whatever they did, whatever they wanted, you are here. With us." Lean cried. Not from fear. From the weightlifting. From that moment she stopped fearing the truth. Instead she chose to rebuild. She planted sunflowers by the fence, brewed herbal tea for passing travelers, and began documenting her dreams in the back of the notebook. Dreams of a city she didn't name, of fire, of escape, but also of kindness, of open fields, and the warm embrace of strangers who became family. The notebook became her voice. One entry read, "I used to think memory was who I was, but now I believe in something stronger, who I become when I choose to stay." Then one rainy evening a young man arrived, soaked, breathless, and carrying a medical bag. "I've been looking for a girl named Alma," he said. Mr. Dew narrowed his eyes. "Why?" "She's my sister." Lean stepped into the doorway, her heart pounding. "You're my brother?" He looked at her with disbelief, tears forming instantly. "Alma? Is it really you?" She didn't know whether to run or collapse. "I'm Ethan," he said. "We thought you were dead." She stared. "I don't remember you." He slowly pulled out a photo, 2 children in a sunflower field holding hands. "That's us. Before everything." Lean felt a jolt in her chest. Something inside her, maybe not memory but instinct, recognized the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Ethan explained everything that night. How they were taken. How she'd vanished. How he'd searched for her ever since. "They wanted to wipe your past, your name. They said you were unstable. But I knew the truth. You were the strongest person I knew." Lean sat in silence, then whispered, "I'm not her anymore." Ethan nodded. "Maybe not. But I'm glad you're alive." She looked at Mr. and Mrs. Dew, standing behind Ethan. "You saved me twice," she said. Ethan turned to them and bowed. "Thank you. I owe you more than I can say." But Lean wasn't ready to leave. "I need more time," she said, "to finish becoming who I am." Ethan stayed for 3 days. Then one morning he hugged her tight. "Whether you remember me or not," he said, "you're my sister. I'll come back. When you're ready." And just like that he left. Lean stood by the fence watching the horizon. She didn't know what tomorrow held. But she had today. And that was enough. It had been 3 weeks since Ethan left the village. Lean had returned to her daily rhythms, caring for the garden, tutoring the village children, and writing in her notebook every night. But even as her life seemed to settle, the edges of her world began to tremble again. The first sign came with the storm. It started with a low rumble at dawn. By mid-morning, the sky had darkened to a shade of bruised steel. Rain fell in cold sheets, and the hills disappeared behind a wall of mist. But it wasn't the weather that unsettled Lean. It was the silence in the wind. That afternoon, she noticed the old scarecrow in the field had been knocked over. It wasn't the wind, she was sure of it. She had tied it tightly to the post just days before. She approached, heart beating faster, and saw something buried in the mud near its feet. A boot print. Too large to be Tan's. Too deep to be old. She turned and ran. At home she found Mr. Dew reinforcing the back doors with planks. He looked up, already expecting what she would say. "They're here," she whispered. "I know," he replied. "We saw someone last night, watching from the edge of the woods." Lean felt her stomach twist. "Is Ethan back?" "No." And he wouldn't hide. That night she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the wind, every whisper of the bamboo felt like footsteps. She clutched the charm she once wore, the one that bore the letter, and pressed it to her chest. At sunrise, the village woke to find one of the chicken coops torn apart. Feathers scattered. No animals taken. A warning. Mrs. Dew tried to keep Lean busy, boiling herbs and preparing breakfast, but her hands trembled as she stirred the pot. "They want you to be afraid," she said. "I am," Lean admitted. "But you're still standing." Later that day, Ton returned from the mountains with news. A black SUV was spotted near the northern pass, he said. Men in suits. They're not from here. Lynn didn't need more proof. She had remembered too much. And someone wanted to erase her again. Then we need to leave, she said. But Mr. Du shook his head. You could run forever. Or you could stop. Stop. Face them. Not alone. Not this time. That evening, she sat at the wooden table and wrote 3 letters, one to Ethan, one to herself, and one she burned without reading. Then she turned to Mr. Du. If I fall, you make sure they don't erase me again. He didn't blink. You won't fall. The next morning, Lynn walked to the river. She wore a simple white dress, her hair tied back, her eyes steady. Ton waited nearby with a walkie-talkie. Hidden in the trees were 6 villagers armed with little more than kitchen tools and farming sticks. But their eyes were fierce. They had chosen her. Now she chose to stand for them. By noon, the SUV appeared at the edge of the village. 2 men stepped out. Sharp suits. Sunglasses even in the gray light. One of them, taller and colder than the other, called out, Alma. It's time to come home. She didn't answer. We can do this the easy way, or I'm not Alma anymore. He smiled. The mind forgets. But the body remembers. You belong to us. I belong here. The shorter man stepped forward. You don't understand what you've done. You've seen too much. You think we'll let you live like this? Lynn didn't flinch. You already let me die once. Just then the villagers stepped from the shadows. Old women with cooking knives. Young men with firewood axes. Children peeking from behind sheds, holding slingshots. The men hesitated. This wasn't what they expected. She's not yours anymore, Mr. Du said calmly, appearing beside Lynn. You think we're scared of peasants? Ton stepped forward. No. But you should be. The standoff stretched long enough to become unbearable. Then a third figure emerged from the forest. It was Ethan. He was wet from the storm, his clothes torn, but his eyes burned with something lethal. She's under my protection now, he said. The taller man raised his phone. We have clearance to extract her. We'll call in support. Then this village becomes a graveyard, Ethan replied. They stared at each other. And then the unexpected happened. Lynn stepped forward alone, placing herself between both groups. No one else dies for me, she said. You want me? Take me. But leave them. Mrs. Du cried out. No. But Lynn's voice was steady. I remember now. The facility. The tests. The experiments. You turned people into weapons. You tried to make me forget. She walked straight up to the men. You didn't succeed. For a second it seemed they might actually grab her. But Ethan pulled something from his bag. A flash drive. I have everything. All your files. All your names. You hurt her and I go public. The taller man's smile faded. You're bluffing. Try me. The tension cracked like lightning. Finally, the shorter man touched his partner's arm. Let's go. They left. No words. No fight. Just silence and the sound of tires spinning out on the wet dirt road. When they were gone, Lynn collapsed. Ethan caught her. The villagers cheered, not loud but long. Quiet pride rippled through their faces. That night by the fire, Lynn read the letter she had written to herself days earlier. You are not broken. You are not erased. You are not theirs. You are fire born of silence. You are light, even in shadows. Ethan stayed 1 more week. They didn't talk about the past. They planted jasmine instead. Drank tea. Watched sunsets. One evening he said, You're going to change the world. She smiled. I just want to change today. And as the stars flickered above the bamboo roof, Lynn finally felt whole. Not because she remembered everything, but because she no longer needed to. The sun rose over the village with a softness that felt earned. After weeks of tension, of fear and shadows, the air was still. The storm had passed, both in the sky and in their lives, at least for now. Lynn stood in the garden, barefoot in dew-wet soil, her hands gently brushing over the leaves of the newly planted jasmine. The petals opened to the morning light, delicate but resilient. She saw herself in them. She hadn't slept much since the standoff. Not because she was afraid, but because something inside her had awakened. For so long she had lived in fragments, of memory, of identity, of doubt. But now those shards had rearranged into something sharper. Something clearer. She was no longer just Alma or Lean or the girl who ran from men in black coats. She was someone who chose to stay. The villagers treated her differently now, not with distance or fear, but with admiration. Children brought her small gifts. Woven bracelets, hand-picked herbs, little notes. The elderly women started calling her, our light. One morning Mr. Dew found her writing furiously in her notebook. "What is it this time?" he asked with a teasing smile. "I'm writing a letter," she replied. "To whom?" "To myself. In case I forget again." He nodded solemnly. "Then write this too. You are never alone. We are your memory now." She smiled, wiped her hands, and handed him a folded sheet of paper. "Can you hide this somewhere safe? Somewhere no one can reach unless I ask." He took it without question. That evening Ethan returned. Not with warnings or fear, but with something that changed everything. "There's been an investigation," he said. "The lab. The organization. It's crumbling. Someone leaked documents, photos, testimonies, the works. The media is circling like hawks." "Was it you?" Lean asked. "No. Someone from inside. A nurse, I think. Maybe someone you once knew." Lean's heart skipped. A faint image, a woman's hand reaching out in the darkness, flashed in her mind. "They won't chase you anymore," Ethan continued. "You're free." The words hit her like a breath she didn't know she was holding. Free. The village held a small celebration that night. Not for her officially, but to mark the end of the rainy season. Lanterns floated above the fields. Music echoed from a single old speaker. Children danced barefoot in the mud, and laughter ran through the trees. Lean sat quietly watching it all, her chest aching. Not with sorrow but with something heavier, gratitude. Mrs. Dew sat beside her, handing her a bowl of rice wine. "So what now?" "I don't know," Lean said. "I feel like I should go. But I also don't want to." "Then maybe you go for the right reason, not to run." Lean nodded. The next day, she took a long walk to the farthest hill, the one that overlooked the entire valley. From there she could see every house, every path, every child's playground and worn dirt trail. And in the distance, the mountain that had nearly killed her, and the forest that had given her back. She sat with her journal in her lap and wrote, "Maybe the world is broken. Maybe I was too. But here, this village, these people, they stitched something whole inside me. Not to replace what I lost, but to remind me that even broken things still bloom." When she returned, Ethan was waiting. "I'm going to Hanoi," he said. "They need someone to speak. On behalf of the victims. On behalf of you." "I should go with you," she said. "Do you want to?" "Yes. But not just to speak." "Then why?" "To start something." He blinked. "Like what?" "I want to find the others. The ones they took. The ones who still believe they're forgotten." Ethan looked at her for a long time. "You've changed." "No," she said. "I just came home to myself." They left the next morning. The entire village came to see her off. Some cried. Some smiled. Mr. Dew placed the folded letter back in her hand. "You don't need this anymore," he said. "I'll keep it anyway," she replied. "It's the truest thing I ever wrote." Before stepping into the car, she turned to the villagers and said one thing. "I will come back. Not because I'm lost, but because this is the place that found me." The journey to Hanoi was long but familiar. She recognized rivers, trees, billboards, cities. The noise didn't frighten her anymore. It just reminded her how quiet strength can be. At the capital, the conference hall was overflowing. Journalists, advocates, survivors. Lean stood before them, her voice steady. "I was once made to forget my name, but I remembered my worth. Not through science, through love, through dirt and firewood and the way an old woman held my hand without asking who I was." The room held its breath. "I'm not here to recount my pain. I'm here to begin something. A center. A refuge. For those who escape. For those still hiding. We will find you. We will remind you that you were never what they said you were." Applause didn't follow immediately. It came in waves. From silence to storm. That night, in a quiet hotel room, she looked at herself in the mirror. She no longer saw a scarred girl. She saw someone who had been broken, stitched back together, and stood taller for it. Weeks later, she returned to the village. Not to stay, but to build. Brick by brick, with the help of villagers and friends, they constructed the center. A safe place. A healing place. A light where memory was no longer the enemy. Lynn planted the first tree in front of the door. A jasmine. And on the plaque beside it, just 6 words. Together we rise. Again. And again. The center opened on the first day of autumn. No ribbon was cut. No speeches were made. Just the quiet arrival of 3 people in a single van, faces drawn, eyes raw. Survivors. Lynn greeted them at the gate with a smile that was both warm and honest. "You're safe now," she said. "We don't ask questions until you're ready to answer them." Inside the small, freshly painted rooms were beds with hand-stitched blankets from the village women, walls covered in drawings by the children Lynn once taught, and shelves stacked with journals waiting to be filled. For days, the new arrivals didn't speak much. They slept, ate in silence, walked the gardens barefoot. One woman, Knock, cried whenever someone handed her food. A man named Tone wouldn't sleep indoors. And the third, a boy barely 18, refused to give his name. Lynn never pushed. She only listened. But their silence did not mean peace. One night, Knock collapsed during a group meal, screaming as if the world was burning. Lynn rushed to her, cradled her head, whispered until her shaking stopped. Later, Knock whispered, "They buried me alive. In the dark. With no sound." Lynn held her tighter. "But you're here now. And the wind still hears you." Tone began carving wood as therapy. At first it was meaningless scratches and lines, but eventually he shaped birds, trees, a village. One afternoon, he handed Lynn a carving of a woman standing barefoot, holding a lantern. "It's you," he said. Lynn smiled, though her hands trembled. "Thank you." But things did not stay calm. One evening, while Lynn sat journaling on the front porch, a black envelope was slid beneath the door. She froze. Inside was a single photo, a close-up of the boy who had yet to give his name, eyes closed, strapped to a table, IVs in his arm. And a note. "Not all the ghosts are gone." Lynn rushed to find him. The boy was already gone. The gate was open. Panic swept through her chest like wildfire. She ran to Ethan's cabin in the back lot. He had stayed to help train staff and protect the perimeter. "He's missing," she said. Ethan grabbed a flashlight. "We secure the village. Then we go after him." The next 12 hours were chaos. The boy had left no note, no belongings. Villagers joined the search. Ton returned from a nearby district to assist. Even Knock, still fragile, helped prepare hot tea for the searchers. When the boy was found, just before dawn, he was sitting at the edge of the forest, barefoot, eyes blank. "I saw them," he whispered. "They're waiting. Watching. They want you." Lynn crouched beside him. "What do they want?" He turned to her slowly. "To destroy what you built. They couldn't silence you, so they'll twist your work instead." In the days that followed, it became clear. Someone was leaking information from the inside. Details about the center, names of survivors, photos of staff. Online, hateful rumors spread. That the center was a cult, a front, a scam. The funding agency called. They were re-evaluating. Volunteers backed out. People stopped arriving. And Lynn, who had carried so many others, now stood on the verge of collapse. That night, she returned to the hill where she had once written, where the wind had helped her remember who she was. And she screamed. The sound echoed like a storm without rain. When she returned to the center, Mrs. Dew was waiting. "You planted this place in a field that once tried to bury you," she said softly. "And it bloomed. That means something. I don't know if I'm strong enough. You never had to be alone." So Lynn did what she always did when she was afraid. She created. She wrote. She painted. She recorded testimonies from every person in the center. Raw, real, unfiltered. She posted them online. She didn't defend herself. She didn't deny the rumors. She told the truth. And the world responded. People began to write back. Survivors from other places. Doctors. Mothers. Former employees of the very labs that had hurt her. One message stood out. "I worked security during your second year. You sang when you were scared. I still remember the song. I'm ready to speak." That message led to a chain of whistleblowers. A new investigation launched. The funders reinstated their support. And one day the boy, now speaking, now smiling, handed Lynn a letter. "I wrote this," he said, "because of you." The letter simply read, "For the first time in years, I woke up and didn't wish I hadn't." Lynn cried reading it. Not because it was sad, but because it was a kind of resurrection. She stood on the porch that evening, the sky stretching pink and gold behind her. The jasmine tree had grown taller. Nok taught yoga in the courtyard now. Tone had built benches for the guests. The center pulsed with life. And though she knew threats would return, she no longer feared them. Because this wasn't just a place anymore. It was a movement. And she wasn't just someone who had survived. She was someone who helped others live. As the stars returned to the sky, Lean lit a single candle in her window and whispered to the night, "Let them come. We carry light now." It was the season of dust again. The winds had shifted, carrying with them the dry scent of bamboo and wood smoke, and Lean found herself standing at the edge of the rice fields, where golden stalks bent under the weight of harvest. Everything was growing again. Not just the land but the center. 2 new dormitories had opened. A mobile team had begun outreach missions to nearby districts. The name Lean's lantern had spread beyond the village, whispered in forums and inboxes like a secret prayer. And yet, something in her heart remained unsettled. At night she'd find herself wandering the old paths near the edge of the forest, the same place she had once been found, broken and nameless. Each time she hoped she'd feel closure. But she never did. Until the letter came. It was handwritten, ink slightly smudged as if touched by trembling fingers. It had no return address. "I heard your voice on the radio. I thought you were dead. But I kept hoping I was wrong. I need to see you, even if just once. D." Lean's fingers went cold. She read the letter again. D. There was no photo, no clue, but something in the curve of the writing shook her. Later that night she asked Ethan, "Do you know anyone whose name starts with D?" He raised a brow. "Why?" But she didn't answer. The next morning, she took the bus to the nearby city. She sat in the back, her face wrapped in a scarf, watching the blur of trees and telephone poles. Her hands held the letter tightly, as if it could dissolve. At the station cafe she waited. And then she saw him. He wore a faded coat and had more gray in his hair than she remembered, or thought she might remember. He approached slowly, as though afraid his steps might shatter her. His name was Dan. She didn't say anything at first. Neither did he. But when their eyes met there was no denying it. This was someone she had once loved. "Maybe. You don't remember," he said gently. "I don't know if it's memory or emotion. But something in me recognizes you." Dan sat across from her, his hands shaking slightly. "You disappeared 3 years ago. No one knew where you went. I searched until I couldn't afford to anymore. Then I got sick. Then I heard a voice on a radio program about trauma survivors, and it was yours." She nodded. "I didn't know I had someone looking." "You had me," he said. They sat in silence. Outside, children ran through the rain with umbrellas like kites. "I was going to propose," Dan whispered, "before you vanished." Lean looked away. "I can't remember who I was, what I was like, what we were. You were bright, fierce, the kind of woman who laughed at thunder. I'm not her anymore." "No," he said. "You're more." They spoke for hours. Dan told her how she'd volunteered to expose the illegal lab posing as a wellness clinic, how she'd gone undercover, how she had risked everything. "But no one ever heard what happened after," he said. "Until now." Back at the center, Lean walked through the halls differently. Dan's visit had opened something. She felt like she was walking through shadows of another version of herself, one that had once dared everything. She looked in the mirror that night and whispered, "What else have I forgotten?" 2 days later, Dan came to the village. He helped in the kitchen, played the guitar for the children, fixed a broken roof tile. No one knew who he was, not even Ethan. But they liked him. And Lean began to remember. Not all at once. Not like a flood. But in fragments. The sound of his laugh during a train ride. The way his hands trembled when he was nervous. The time they got lost on a hiking trip and ate wild bananas for dinner. And then, one night, the memory of the moment he had kissed her before she left for the undercover assignment. "Come back to me," he had said. And she never had. Until now. She told Ethan everything. "You trust him?" Ethan asked. "Yes," she said. "And I trust myself now too." But just as she was beginning to feel whole again, the news arrived. One of the escaped scientists from the facility had been seen in a border province. He was recruiting again, offering therapies in rural areas. And one of their old survivors, Nock, had family there. Lean felt her heart ache. We have to go. Ethan hesitated. Are you sure? After everything. She cut him off. This is why I came back. This is what I was reborn for. And so they packed. Dan insisted on going with her. He said nothing, just stood beside her with a quiet strength she didn't need to remember to trust. The village gathered to see them off. This time they didn't cry. They simply nodded, because now they understood this was Lean's calling. As the van disappeared down the road, Ton turned to Mrs. Dew and said, "She left with a name once." Mrs. Dew nodded. "And now she leaves with a legacy." The road to Kwang Sun province was long and littered with silence. Dust rose behind their van in soft clouds as mountains rolled like waves in the distance. Lean sat between Ethan and Dan, her fingers curled around the corner of her notebook. They were heading toward rumors. A whisper about a new center, offering advanced memory therapies to villagers for free. The founder? A man with cold eyes and a surgical smile. His name was Dr. Pham Duway, one of the last. A man who had once called Lean Subject A9. They arrived just as the sun began to melt behind the hills. Kwang Sun was quieter than expected. Rice fields stretched endlessly. Children waved at the van, unaware of the storm approaching. Lean and Ethan met with the local teacher who had sent the warning. They came 2 weeks ago, the woman said. Said they were doing research. Offered help to a boy who stuttered. His mother agreed. The boy hasn't been the same since. Where is he? Lean asked. Sleeping. Or sedated. I don't know anymore. Dan stayed behind to help at the school while Ethan and Lean drove toward the clinic. It wasn't a clinic. It was a repurposed warehouse on the edge of the village, surrounded by silence. No signage. Just men in black jackets with earpieces pacing like ghosts. Lean tightened her scarf. Inside, a girl no older than 15 sat strapped to a chair, eyes closed. A headset hummed on her head, lights blinking. She didn't move. Lean stepped forward. The nearest man blocked her path. You can't be here. Ethan showed his credentials. We're here on behalf of the Humanitarian Oversight Board. The man hesitated. Then through a side door Pham Duway entered. His hair was silver now, but his smile hadn't aged. Ah, Alma, he said, as if greeting a relative. It's Lean, she replied. You don't get to name me anymore. He chuckled. And yet here you are, back in the house of your birth. I didn't come to argue, she said. I came to shut this down. He gestured toward the girl. She came willingly. She's a child. She's healing. She's being rewritten. Dewey's smile faded. You don't understand what we're building. No, Lean said. I understand exactly what you're destroying. And with that, she reached into her bag, pulled out a hidden recorder and hit play. Dozens of whistleblower testimonies began echoing through the room. Names, methods, accounts. Outside, 2 local police officers stepped forward, summoned hours earlier by Ethan. Duway stared at her. You think this ends with me? She stepped closer. No. It ends with us. The girl was freed. Her pulse normal. Her breath shallow, but she opened her eyes. And whispered. Thank you. They shut down the facility within hours. News spread quickly. Journalists arrived. The footage went viral. And suddenly Lean wasn't a survivor anymore. She was a movement. Back at the village, Lean sat by the jasmine tree under moonlight. Dan brought her tea. Ethan leaned against the wall nearby, smiling softly. You did it, Ethan said. She shook her head. We did it. Nock and Tone arrived days later with new volunteers. Survivors from other villages. People ready to rebuild. Not as patients but as teachers, advocates, leaders. The center doubled its efforts. And soon governments began to listen. Laws shifted. Grants flowed. The world, slow and imperfect, turned its eyes toward justice. One morning Dan placed a small box in her hands. I bought this a long time ago, he said. Inside was a silver ring, simple, unassuming. I don't know if you remember what we were, he said. But I know who you are now. And I'd follow you into fire. Lean didn't cry. She smiled. And placed the ring beside the notebook on her nightstand. That night she gathered everyone. Staff, survivors, children around a fire. She stood in front of them and said, they tried to take our names, our voices, our light, but we took them back. Together. This is not the end. This is the echo. We are the ones who remember, not with pain but with purpose. We are not what was done to us. We are what we choose to do with it. And in the silence that followed, the wind carried their breath upward like a prayer. Months later, Lean returned to the forest. Alone, she walked the path where she'd once fallen, where pain and rebirth intertwined. At the place she was found, she placed a single stone, not as a memorial but as a marker, a start. As she turned to leave, a girl, one of the new arrivals, stood watching from the trees. "Is it true?" the girl asked. "You forgot everything?" "I did," Lean replied. "Did it hurt?" "Only the parts that mattered." "Are you afraid it'll happen again?" "No," she said, "because I've built something that will remember for me." The girl nodded. "Will you help me forget?" Lean stepped forward, took the girl's hands and said softly, "No. I'll help you remember, but differently. Not the pain. The rising." 1 year later, the center had a new name. The Echo House. It had outposts in 3 provinces. Podcast. A law clinic. A mobile trauma unit. But every night, Lean returned to her room. The same room in the original house. The jasmine tree outside bloomed year-round now. And on her wall hung a single photograph. Lean, Ethan, Dan, Noctone, and 12 former patients, now staff. No one wore masks. No one hid scars. Because in their eyes was something stronger than healing. It was purpose. Final entry, Lean's journal. "I don't know who I will be in 10 years. I don't know what we'll have to fight next. But I know this. If memory is a burden, then let purpose be the bridge. We rise not because we are unbroken, but because we carry each other light by light, step by step." This story is not mine alone. It never was.
Right to be so full of vitality and joy after such a short time. She described it, her travels around the world with sparkling eyes, and her plans for the next year with a joyful smile. What a contrast to how I was. Phyllis had been so open with me. I felt encouraged her to ask her, "Did you ever feel like you were just waiting to die?" I don't mean to I don't mean to die. I just mean feeling like all you were doing was going through the motions with no filter and no purpose. She emphatically stated, "No, no, never." I must have looked incredulous because she shared the following story. When she was a little girl, her family lived in Java, where her dad was an executive with Shell Oil. One day, Japanese soldiers came to the door and took her dad away with a bayonet pointed at his back.